The most disturbing thing Philip Zimbardo discovered in his Stanford Prison Experiment was not what the guards did. It was who the guards were. They were ordinary people. And in fewer than 5 days, the situation had done the rest. In 1971, Zimbardo took psychologically screened, healthy college students and randomly assigned them roles as guards or prisoners in a simulated prison in the basement of Stanford University. No prior history of aggression, no ideological programming. Within hours, guards who had no history of sadism began using psychological torture. Prisoners, volunteers who could leave at any time, lapsed into learned helplessness and forgot that option existed. The experiment had to be stopped after 6 days. Not because something had gone wrong, because something had gone exactly according to the logic of the situation. What Zimbardo documented was the power of the situation to override character. But situation alone does not explain how ordinary people commit atrocities while believing they are doing something neutral or even honorable. For that mechanism, you need Albert Bandura's 1975 research on moral disengagement. Bandura demonstrated that a single word could function as what he called a moral anaesthetic, a label that switches off the brain's empathy circuitry without the person noticing the switch being thrown. In his study, when participants overheard an assistant describe a target group as animals, they immediately increased the intensity of electric shocks they administered, far beyond those who heard the group described as nice guys. They were not ordered to escalate. The word did it for them. This is not a metaphor. Linguistic dehumanization is a documented neurological mechanism. Once you stop perceiving a target as fully human, you do not need to overcome your conscience to harm them. Your conscience has already been quietly reassigned. In the early 1960s, Stanley Milgram ran what became the most replicated and most disturbing series of psychological experiments in history. He wanted to know how many ordinary Americans would administer potentially lethal electric shocks to a stranger if a man in a lab coat told them it was necessary for science. The answer was 2/3. 2/3 of participants continued delivering shocks up to the maximum 450-volt level, clearly labeled danger, severe shock, even while hearing the person in the next room screaming in apparent agony, then going silent. They did not want to. Many were visibly distressed, but they continued because the authority figure said, "The experiment requires that you continue." The mechanism Milgram identified was not cruelty. It was the progressive nature of the increments. You do not go from 0 to 450 volts in one step. You go from 15 to 30, then 45. Each step is small enough that refusing it feels disproportionate. Feels like the problem is with you, not the instruction. By the time you reach 450, you have already agreed to 28 previous escalations. The path to harm is always a series of small, reasonable-seeming steps, not a single dramatic choice. What makes all three mechanisms, situation, language, and authority, so effective is that they do not operate on your reason. They operate on something far more primitive, your need to belong. C.S. Lewis identified what he called the inner ring, the invisible social circle of acceptance and status that every person spends enormous energy trying to enter and remain inside. The terror of being excluded from that circle is not a weakness of insecure people. It is a survival mechanism that operates in everyone. And a system that controls access to that circle controls behavior without ever issuing a direct instruction. You will tolerate a great deal of ethical compromise to avoid the social death of being left outside. Research confirms what Lewis observed philosophically. Your brain registers social exclusion with the same neurological intensity as physical pain. The person who controls your sense of belonging does not need a weapon. They need only the capacity to close a door. The Stanford Prison Experiment was not a one-time anomaly. The same social psychological principles were documented 3 decades later in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Guards working the night shift, free from the rational oversight of command structure and operating under the anonymity that uniforms and institutional authority provide, systematically committed acts of sexual humiliation and torture against prisoners. They photographed themselves doing it. They described it as fun, not because they were psychopaths, because the situation had removed the four conditions that normally constrain human behavior: visibility, accountability, individual identity, and the perception that the target is fully human. Zimbardo, who served as an expert witness in the Abu Ghraib trials, documented the same arc he had observed in 1971. Ordinary people, a permissive institutional environment, the removal of oversight, and the gradual normalization of escalating harm. The barrel was different. The apples behaved identically. What makes this relevant to you specifically is not the prison. It is the mechanism. The conditions that produced Abu Ghraib are not unique to military institutions. They are reproducible in any hierarchical environment where accountability is selectively removed. The reason most people find this research intellectually interesting rather than personally alarming is a cognitive mechanism called the self-serving bias, the near-universal tendency to believe that you are the exception to patterns that apply to other people. You are more moral than average, more independent than average, less susceptible to authority and social pressure than average. Statistically, this cannot be true for most people who believe it. But the belief is not generated by evidence. It is generated by the brain's need to maintain a coherent self-concept. Christopher Browning's research on Reserve Police Battalion 101, ordinary German policemen, most middle-aged, most without strong ideological conviction, who shot over 38,000 Jewish civilians in Polish villages over a single summer in 1942, found that they were offered the option to refuse. Most did not take it, not because they were ordered to participate under threat of death, because the social cost of stepping out of the group felt, in the moment, greater than the moral cost of what the group was doing. These were not monsters. They were people who believed, as you believe, that they were fundamentally decent. Understanding the Lucifer effect does not mean accepting that you are inevitably capable of atrocity. It means understanding that your character is not the fixed internal constant you believe it to be. It is a situated response, something that expresses itself differently depending on the visibility of accountability, the language in use around you, the authority structures you operate inside, and the social cost of dissent. This is not a counsel of despair. It is the only framework that gives you genuine agency. Because once you stop believing you are immune to the barrel, you can finally see it being built around you. You can name the incremental escalations before you are too far inside them. You can identify the language being used to reassign your moral compass. You can recognize the authority figure who has quietly accepted responsibility for your actions on your behalf. The person who believes they would have refused, who is certain they would have stepped out of Reserve Police Battalion 101, certain they would have stopped the shocks at 150 volts, is the person most likely to be standing at 450 before they notice where they are. The person who takes Zimbardo seriously is the person who might actually stop. Character is not what you have. It is what you choose when the system stops watching and the group closes its doors. The next pattern we are covering is what happens when the person building the barrel around you does not have a conscience to suppress in the first place. That video is linked here.